got another year to go.
So stressed over my car. I mean, literally, I couldn't everything can happen.
Right in the water.
I'm taking it at 7 o'clock on Thursday morning. I got the first time. First time they could get me.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, dear.
Could I have a 7-8?
Valerie, you believe.
Sure. Just open that and pretend.
Is
I believe she's there. Who's that?
Well, let's call this meeting to order. Notice of an open work session of the City Council of North Kansas City, Missouri, July 17th, 2018. Mr. Eric.
Thank you, sir. Tonight's work session is a presentation by the North Kansas City Levy District. So at this point, I'd like to call on the president of the Levy District, Richard Lanning, to kick off their presentation.
So, thank you, Mayor and City Council persons. We appreciate your time tonight and allowing us to speak and give a presentation on behalf of the North Kansas City Levy District. Before we get started, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Leon Staub, our district engineer, but I thought I'd go through and give you the overall structure of the levy district. There are 5 board members. They're all elected by the property owners within the district. They serve for a term of 5 years each, and every year we re-elect or elect a board member to the Board of Supervisors at our February landowners meeting. So my name is Richard Lanning. I'm president of NT Realty, and I also serve as president of the board. We have Ed Brown with Coleman Brown, located over off of Burlington. Bear Kistler's on the board. Bear's retired from, I think, the Water District in North Kansas City. He's a former city councilman. Christopher Sanford. He is with the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, and David Zimmer with Newmark Grubb Zimmer. We also have a secretary of the board, Jerry Brandt, with the law firm of Withers, Brandt, Igo, and Mullinex. They're out of Liberty. Their firm's been associated with the levy district since the early 1900s. This evening we have Leon Staub, our district engineer, and Miranda Sloan with Burns & McDonald. Burns & McDonald has represented the district since 1951. So we have a lot of history here with Burns & McDonald and Jerry Brandt as the secretary of the board. We also have a levy security officer, Bill Hudson. Bill is with us this evening. So before I turn it over to Leon Staub, on behalf of the board, I would like to thank the city council, for everything you do to support the levy district. We are able to operate the North Kansas City Levy District at a very low cost compared to all the other districts in the Kansas City area because of your help and support. And the levy district receives its funding through what's called a benefit assessment. It's not a tax. And it's a little bit different than a tax. Everybody pays their share of that benefit assessment. Our company is one of the largest contributors, and the city also pays. So again, thank you for everything you do. You keep our costs low, which keeps everybody else's costs, from a business owner to, you know, the smallest residential home in North Kansas City. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Leon Staub, our district engineer.
Thank you. As we go through the presentation tonight, if you guys would like to stop and interrupt me and ask questions, that's perfectly fine. If you guys want to have more of a conversation than a presentation. Can you hear me okay? Okay. If you look up on the map here, this is an overview of the North Kansas City levy unit. So the levy unit is the line of protection that goes all the way around North Kansas City. The unit is divided into 2 parts. The lower section, which is owned and operated by the North Kansas City Levee District. That's the red line. And then we have the airport section, which is the levee that goes around the airport, and that is owned and operated by the city of Kansas City, Missouri. So for whatever reason, back in the 1950s when they set this up, they divided the jurisdictions into two parts. And they're called local sponsors. And each local sponsor is responsible for the operation and maintenance of their system. In reality, it's one system, so we're very interdependent on the function of the airport levee and they on us. If one fails, they both fail. So we have a good relationship with the city of Kansas City, Missouri, and we help each other out when we can. The initial levee was constructed in actually 1908 by some of the local landowners, but the Corps came in 1946 and did the upgrade to it. And then after the flood of 1951, they came back in and did some more repair work and some upgrades to it. It's a what we call a 500-year levee, which is far in excess of what is needed for FEMA certification, which is the 100-year. The system has gone through a 500-year event back in 1993 without significant consequences, or it performed as it should have. We have 6.25 miles of earthen levee, 3 closure structures. One is in the Burlington northern in Murray Yard up at the north end, and there's one at Holmes and there's one at Cherries. So these are low points in the levee where either the trains have to pass through or where cars pass through. And when there's a flood event, these have to be closed. And we rely on the city and the fire department and the police department, I believe, monitor it during a flash flood event, and they actually make the closures. And they do it without, with permission from the levee district, but without notification. So we didn't want to be an obstruction to the time that it takes. So the fire chief makes the call to make the closures, and it's done. And we do that because the only employee of the levee district is sitting right back here. And the levee district just doesn't have the resources to do it itself. We can't get up here fast enough. And we've trained with the fire department on a number of occasions, and I think they can do each one in about 10 minutes. So, in 2013, the Corps of Engineers installed 2 new under seepage systems along Harlem and National Starch. These were a result of some of the performance that was seen during the 1993 flood, and they simply added to the reliability of the levee system. Those under seepage collection systems have 31 relief wells. Since the levee creates a bit of a bathtub around North Kansas City, when the river comes up, we have to close the storm sewers that go out to the river, and we have to pump the water out of it, out of the interior. So there are 6 pump stations associated with the levee district. 3 of them are owned by the levee district, and 3 of them are owned by the city itself. The city leases the district's pump stations, and they actually do all the operation and maintenance through a lease agreement. Any questions? I included this slide to just kind of discuss with you kind of the 2 federal entities that kind of oversee or have an impact on the operation and maintenance of the levee system. First and foremost is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and by federal law, which is the Navigation and Navigable Waters Act, is the law in which the levee district operates. All levees operate under it. There is also a program with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for rehabilitation assistance after a flood event. And to stay eligible in that program, you have to meet the criteria for operation and maintenance. And that is why once a year the Corps of Engineers comes out and does an inspection. They identify any deficiencies, and then the levy district has to address those deficiencies within a certain amount of time to stay eligible in the program. So what that means is after every flood, we get a letter from the Corps of Engineers asking if there's been any damage, and if there has been, we submit a proposal or what our needs are, and the Corps will evaluate them to see if we're eligible for funding. Those are the key drivers for how the levy district operates the system. The other federal agency is FEMA, and despite what you might think, they do not have that big of a role in the oversight of the levy system. The only thing that we've ever done recently was levy certification and accreditation, which was approved back in 2013. So what that means is we had to certify that the levy meets all of FEMA's requirements. And it includes things like freeboard and operation and maintenance, and whether or not you have a warning system, whether or not you have in place an evacuation system of the city. FEMA wants everyone just to be prepared in the event of a flood. So we went through the certification process, and you guys actually had to sign off on the certification because you are the flood insurance administrator for the interior. You guys control the rate maps, and I believe Pat's the floodplain administrator for the city. So we gave you the information, you gave it to FEMA, and then FEMA prepared the flood risk maps for the city accordingly. Okay. All right, Richard touched a little bit on the district's operational budget and its spending plan, and in the past few years there has been quite a bit of an investment into the levy system itself. Starting back in about 2010, the Corps came in and wanted to construct the 2 under seepage systems. So the district had a cost share on both the design and the construction of those. And we went out for bond for about $6 million. Is that correct, Richard? So we have a $6 million recent investment in the levy. Not everything was dedicated to the under seepage systems, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the other projects that we've done. What we started to discover at around 2015, 2016 is that the levy district needed to gradually start to increase the money that it was taking in. We were beginning to deplete the reserves and to have a little bit of deficit spending. So we're in a process of gradually increasing the levy assessment to all the landowners. So in 2015, it was at about $420,000. Last year, we bumped it up to $475,000, and this year it's going to $550,000, with a goal of it additionally or getting it to $625,000. What that does is it allows the district to maintain its spending for operation, maintenance, and administration, and it does not include, there's a little room for capital improvement spending, but not a lot, and they've decided to keep the overall rates low, that if a major capital improvements project were to ever be needed, that they would go out for another bond issue to fund it. The major capital improvements that are coming up that have been identified in the future are the riprap overlay projects, which have to be done about every 30 years. So you see a peak there in 2015 and another peak there in 2028, and those are the riprap projects that we're planning to do. Everybody is always concerned about the impact to the general homeowners within North Kansas City and what a rate increase means to them. So I pulled up a sheet that just has some statistics about the property owners within the district. We have 860 properties and 1,260 landowners. Mr. Lanning here is the biggest landowner within the district by far. And like Richard said, the assessment is based on the value of the assets on each property. And that assessment is assigned by the court, the district court. And the district cannot change anybody's assessment, so they can't just arbitrarily change it. They can, however, change the rate at which they collect taxes. So if you owe 5%, that's always the same, whether you raise or lower the assessment. So the top 5% landowners contribute to 60% of the maintenance assessment, and the top 10% contribute to 72% of the total. So if you look at the red line, which is up there at around 60,000, that's the top landowner, which is NT Realty. If you look, once you get past a property ranking of $200 or 200, those are your residents and small businesses. So there's very little impact to a rate increase for most of the landowners, just because of how everything is distributed. So in 2017, the average property owner paid $116 a year for the levy. And I think there are some as low as $2. Like Richard said, we have a great partnership with the city, and it's only grown stronger over the last few years. Like I said before, the city leases the pump stations, and they do all the operation and maintenance. And I know that Pat and his staff, they go out and they check them a few times a week, and they do the operation. Very, very complimentary of the work that they do. With every core inspection that we have, we're told that the pump stations are in some of the cleanest and in the best shape that they've ever seen. So compliments to your staff. We also do plan review and permitting. So there are special conditions that occur during a flood event that most people don't think happen if you do a normal development, because the groundwater in North Kansas City comes up to the surface and it starts pressing on the bottom of structures. It wants to lift everything up out of the ground. So we do plan review and permitting for compliance with core guidelines. And the levy district relies on the city through the codes and building permit process, to send those people to us so that we can do a proper review of it. And I think the protocol is that you can't get a building permit until you've had a letter of acceptance from the levy district. So that's how we enforce our plan review procedures. We also rely on the city to do the closures at North Holmes and North Cherry stop log gaps, and haven't had to do it yet this year, but last August we did it twice. We have a regular schedule for training, where we just take an afternoon or a morning and run up with the fire department and make the closures. And we want to do that about every 2 years. We found that there's not much turnover with your fire crews, and the information is fairly well retained. So and I should say it's not just the fire department, it's the police department and public works as well, to control traffic and just kind of help do general setup.
How often is that training? You said every 2 years?
We try to do it about every 2 years.
And do they test the equipment as far as the closures, the gates and everything? Do they test that periodically as well? The stop logs are, they're just, well, they're stop logs. So they're just some aluminum members that they just stack, and they build a temporary wall. Oh, okay, all right. So
Yeah.
it's not a gate or?
No.
Okay, all right.
No. 2 guys could probably do it. I think they usually bring out the full crew, and they can get it up really quick.
Okay.
The bad thing is about setting it up is it's usually raining very hard, and it's usually at night. So, all right. So flood response. We talk about flood response for a flash flood up on the hillside, but there's also the flood response for the Missouri River. And in the last major flood response that we had was in 1993, and we got a lot of assistance from the city on that, which included manpower, coordination with fire and police, our protocol is that for any communications, goes through the city's communications director. And I think we established that protocol in 2011. And the thing that you need to know is the levee district is responsible for a flood fight, and the city assists during that until it's time to call for an evacuation of the interior. And if that were to ever happen, then everything gets turned over to your emergency manager, and the evacuation will be the responsibility of the city. So that would be a fairly extreme circumstances, but we do have that in our plan. Okay, so some of the recent projects that we've done, I went back to 2012, just kind of touch on some of our recent ones. In 2012, the fire department was setting up the hillside stop logs fairly routinely, and they expressed some concern that it wasn't safe because of the traffic late at night. So we installed some pipe gates to go across the road and some warning lights, just kind of help the fire crews do it safely and to control the traffic. In 2013, and the Corps of Engineers came in and installed the Harlem and National Starch under seepage systems. This controls groundwater during a flood, keeps Harlem from flooding like it did in 1993, and it's supposed to alleviate some of the problems that National Starch had in 1993.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. I needed the break. One of the major concerns that has come up since probably 2010 is bed degradation of the Missouri River. Does anybody know what that means? Have you heard about that? I believe you contributed to the study of the Corps of Engineers. But basically what that is the Missouri River, the bed, the bottom of it, is gradually lowering for some reason that the Corps doesn't want to seem to place blame on anybody. But what that has done is at one point it had dropped, I think, 30 feet since the levee was constructed. And that's generally not a problem for us because the levee doesn't set right at the river. But along the Broadway extension, there is no distinction between the levee and the bank of the river. So when the river drops, it starts to lose material at the toe of the levee, and we started to get concerned that the levee would become unstable. So fortunately, we were geared up to, as part of the original bond was to put riprap and shore up the toe. And then fortunately, we had the flood of 2011, and that is when the Corps got really nervous about it, and they found some emergency funding, and they put the riprap in on their own and just told us that they did it. So they did some in 2011, and they did it again in 2012. And what we do is now generally about every 2 years, the Corps of Engineers does a bathymetric survey. They share the data with us, and we just make sure that the riprap is still there and that the levee's still stable. So all's good. We got bathymetric survey in 2017 and showed that everything was still where it was originally placed. We did levee certification in 2013. We did a project along the hillside ditch in 2014. That was to keep the ditch from meandering into the levee itself. In 2015, we had some of the bond money that needed to be spent, and the board decided to start working on some of its overlay projects early. So we did an overlay along the Broadway extension. That's what this project right here is. I got a backhoe just piling riprap on the side of the levee. We kept going with the riprap overlays until we ran out of money. So we were able to do the section along the Broadway extension and then do some work down along Harlem and almost all the way to National Starch. So those projects extend the life of that riprap by at least another 30 years. And then in 2016, we did an update to the emergency action plan. Okay, that's about it for major projects. Any questions about those? Nope. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about flood risk because it impacts the people within North Kansas City. So we put a lot of time and effort and money into the levee system to increase reliability and decrease risk. But the Corps of Engineers is never satisfied, and they've identified 3 things that they would like us to work on in the future. One is the hillside levee flash flooding. And I'll talk about that in a minute. One is the continual monitoring of the Missouri River bed degradation, and the last one is your evacuation plan. Okay, everybody knows that when we get a good rainfall here up in North Kansas City, that ditch comes up quick and it can get almost to the top. When we did certification back in 2013, we could not certify that levee for an event, for a flash flood event. We could certify it for a Missouri River flood event because the water doesn't back up that far into the ditch. But when you get a rainfall here in North Kansas City and a flash flood, there's a lot of water that comes down off the bluff, and it can get pretty close to the top of the levee. So when we did our modeling, we found out that it didn't meet the freeboard requirements, and that a 100-year flood event could possibly overtop the levee. So that's not necessarily a good thing, but the silver lining in that is it's a fairly peaky storm, so if it would overtop, it wouldn't be a whole lot of volume of water coming into North Kansas City. Yes, sir.
Tell me if I'm wrong or not, but isn't there a problem that for lack of a better term, the tunnel, the hole underneath I-35, I-29 isn't big enough and the state won't let us make it bigger? No, not at all. I'm gonna show you where it's predicted to overtop, and it's not at that location. Okay. The underlying problem is you can't raise the levee. It's got to be raised 4 or 5 feet just to meet the freeboard requirements, and that really didn't buy us anything. You'd have to fix all the roads that go up and over the top of it to do that. What needs to happen is the levee needs to move away from the bluff so that it has more capacity, which gets into another area of really excessive cost to do that. I will say that, I've been doing this for 20 years and it's never actually overtopped, and we've had some pretty big storms. So a 100-year event could possibly pass at the very top of the levee, but according to FEMA, they just want to see that extra 3 feet of space as a safety net. So what this does is it impacts the flood insurance rates along the toe of that levee. Everybody understand that? Levee is certified for a Missouri River event, not certified for a hillside flash flood. Two very different floods that do not occur at the same time.
A few years ago, and I don't know, maybe the chief can remember, I was on the fire department then, but if it didn't overflow, all of Mackin Park was underwater. And a lot of the homes where the new houses are now were underwater, or had water not over the buildings. But now that's never happened again since we put those retention ponds.
Yeah.
But still, there's a small quantity of people that had to pay a good sum of money for flood insurance.
We had one event a few years ago where it rained very hard up on the hillside levee. There was I think it was on Cherry. Cherry comes down the hill. I think there was an obstruction in the ditch, and the water actually kicked out onto the roadway and went across the bridge. So it wasn't intercepted by the ditch. Do you remember that? Yeah, that's what happened. So you got water into North Kansas City simply because the water was coming down the road and wasn't intercepted by the levee. So there's odd things like that that can happen as well.
But there's no remedy for the people that had to pay the flood insurance and it's never flooded that I know of.
No, there's not.
And they've redrawn the maps recently, haven't they?
Yes.
Yeah.
They have, and I'll show you in a little bit what your maps say so that you understand it.
And didn't the government get out of the flood insurance subsidies? I understood they did anyway, and everybody now is paying like double what they used to.
It's the federal government's intent to slowly do away with the subsidies for flood insurance. But they're doing it very slowly. But that means it's going to be continued increase over the years.
All right, so we had a few meetings with FEMA, and they have done some detailed modeling of the hillside ditch. And the areas in red are where their model predicts the overtopping. So there's a little piece west of North Oak that would overtop into the area of the Kansas City, Missouri's water treatment plant. We have the two gaps at North Holmes and North Cherry. And then we have the reach along Mackin Park. So if it were to overtop, most of the water would go into Mackin Park. I'll reiterate or point out that this is a model, a prediction of the model, and not something that has ever been observed. But these are the areas where we're exploring some other options. All right, so as a result of us not being able to certify the hillside levee, this is what your flood insurance rate map looks like along Mackin Park. And it has most of the park and then a significant portion of houses located in a zone AH, which is an area of shallow flooding. And everybody has to, they don't have to purchase flood insurance unless their lender requires it, but they probably should. FEMA has not resolved our issue with not being able to certify the levee. And so when they reissued the floodplain maps, they put a big cloud around it and they said that this area is protected by a levee that does not meet the requirements of certification and it will be changed in the future. So this is kind of a temporary depiction of the flood risk, and there is an intent by FEMA to come back in and redefine this a little bit better. They have not told us when that is going to happen.
Redefine it how?
There could be some additional study that goes with it just to make sure that the depths and the extents of flooding are accurate or more accurate than what's depicted. I believe that this representation of the floodplain did not change. It's been that way always. So they didn't restudy it. They didn't analyze it. They just didn't change it from what you had before. That makes sense. Is that a true statement?
Yeah, I guess I thought it did change. That's why I'm.
Some of it changed, but they did not restudy this area.
I think the map that Pat showed me, because I'm concerned because I live on 24th down close to 25th's all in it, as far as I know. And I live on I've never been in it before. And I think Pat showed me a new map and it caught the back end of my property, which, not the house,
Yeah.
but if you're in it, you're in it type thing.
Pat, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, a couple of things real quick. First, the mapping in 2015 was much more technical than in 76, and so it's more accurate. They didn't change the floodplain, but when they mapped it, it did make a difference to some property owners. Like, it would come over and onto their yards, but not much.
Yeah.
I'd like to point out on the Northgate area, that before construction began of homes, that was taken, removed from the floodplain itself by FEMA. So they won't take it off the map for some reason. That's just what they do.
Maybe that's what I remember, but yeah, my neighborhood is completely out of it, I guess, at this point, but if we're still on the map.
We have a letter of map amendment, as FEMA requires, that is attached to a map. And many properties in the avenues also have received a letter of map amendment. And they're not in the floodplain, but they all show, this shows they all are. But if you have that documentation, you're officially not in it.
But to get that, you gotta have an elevation done, don't you?
Yeah, you have to have an elevation certificate, and you have to find that the lowest adjacent grade is above the base floodplain elevation.
Yeah, and is it just any piece of your property or your structure? 'Cause my house is not in it, the old map, but I think it comes on that easement in the back, the utility easement.
Yeah, it's whatever the lowest part of the earth that hits your house, that elevation needs to be, you know.
But if your house is not in it, do you still have to buy flood insurance because part of your yard's in it or
No.
not? Oh, okay. That's kind of what because people ask me that, and I want to know for myself too.
Now, I think the levy district still, everyone knows might be a good idea to get flood insurance if it's all around your house.
Well, it would, but it almost doubled after the government, you said they started slowly, but I think the insurance got, as an example, I used to pay like $600 a year on 25th Street just for flood insurance. And somebody told me in the neighborhood they pay like $1,100-1,200 now a year.
Well, it became effective in 2012, 25% increase to, and then there was an act of Congress that stopped that because it affected everybody. And so this act of Congress kept it, it's going to be a very slow increase over a number of years rather than they were going to try to do it in 4 years.
Yeah, a lot of people told me they have the insurance that live up here that don't have to have it, but they do it anyway because it's so cheap when you're not in the zone, or it used to be anyway. I think Bear told me that he buys it and he's not required to, but he does anyway. So anyway, that's okay. Good. Thank you.
And actually, the entire city is in a risk zone because of the levee itself. So, but the rates are even, the risk is considered less because the levee was certified. So everybody should be encouraged to purchase flood insurance in North Kansas City. That's not an indictment of the condition of the levee. That's just the board's stance on the matter. And what we're asked to do by the federal government is to make sure that everybody is aware of their risk and to plan accordingly.
Are you saying that the only way to really fix that is to widen the ditch?
Yeah.
That'd be
That would be a major undertaking. What we have been discussing with the board is, if you look at this map zone here, this is the floodplain generally based on the assumption that there's no levee there. That's how FEMA will map a flood risk for a levee that's not certified. They just pretend it's not there. There is an option to kind of get partial credit for your levee if you can get an engineer to certify that the levee will not breach if it starts to overtop. So once water starts flowing over the top of the levee, you get a little bit of water into North Kansas City. May not be that big a deal. May be able to be handled by the interior drainage system without causing anybody any flooding. It may cause some minor flooding. But if you can have some assurance that it's not going to breach, then that flood zone that's shown on this map could get smaller, and you could actually get people out of the floodplain. That's not an easy undertaking as well. We'd probably have to armor the landward side of the levee so that if water ever overflowed, it wouldn't erode away. And we know that that levee has failed in the past. Richard actually has some pictures of looks like 40s or early 50s where there was a levee breach near Holmes or Cherry, and it just caused shallow flooding to some of those existing houses.
I don't want to see those.
Nobody wants to see those. We good? So we have some risk management strategies for the hillside levee, and a lot of that has to do with training and planning. So like I said before, we train twice a year, or every 2 years generally, and keep the firemen well educated and well versed on how to make those closures. And like I said, they can do it each one in about 10 minutes, and that's pretty fast. So time is of the essence when a flash flood hits. We also do a little bit more maintenance on the ditch than we do in other places. The ditch is mowed once a month to keep the grass and the woody growth down. The culverts are cleaned every 2 years, and the woody growth, cattails and brush that kind of impede the water flow are cleared twice a year, generally once during the winter, and then we do a mid-year clearing to keep the channel open as possible. So it's all an effort to keep everything as open as possible and the water flowing. Okay. All right, so the other thing that the Corps has identified is the evacuation plan. Okay, so when we did certification, part of that process was we had to document that there was an evacuation plan in place to get the people out from behind the levee. And back in 2013, you guys had a plan that was just a general plan for evacuation of the city under any circumstance. And the Corps come back and they said, you know, that's good that you have a plan, but we would really recommend that you have a plan that is specific to a levee breach, because the levee can breach at different locations around the city, and where it breaches kind of dictates on how you might evacuate the city. And so that's one of the things that we would like to start having discussions with the emergency responders is how might we tweak that plan to make it more applicable to a flood. Since we did certification, the Corps has actually developed some mapping, and they've done some breach analyses around the levee, and they can map time versus water depth throughout the city based on where this thing. So you guys haven't seen that yet. We haven't shared it, but we do have some new information that we can use. The other thing that the levee district has done is we have requested assistance from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to help us out with this. So they are considering our proposal and what that would, not exactly sure what that would entail, but maybe some assistance with developing the plan and maybe a tabletop exercise with the first responders, just to kind of walk through what could happen during a flood event. Yes?
When we're talking about a flood event, we're talking about a Missouri River flood event similar to '93, where we were on the verge. We had a plan in place then, but we're also talking about a flash flood event as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Missouri River flood event, a breach in the levee or a failure would lead to the evacuation of North Kansas City, whereas a hillside levee breach probably wouldn't, right? And you guys have got that down pretty good.
Okay.
So,
all right.
So it's for a Missouri River flood event.
So that's what we're, specifically if we were going to develop an evacuation plan, it would be for a Missouri River levee breach.
Yes.
Okay.
at about 4 different locations. So if it breaches in PID, you've got a plan. If it breaches in Harlem, there's a plan. If it breaches, you know, up by the railroad, there's a plan.
Okay.
And then finally, the Missouri River itself causes some risk, and we monitor the bed degradation and how it's impacting the river, or impacting the riprap along the river. And like I said, we met with the Corps of Engineers about a month ago. Is that right? Okay. And they recommended that we draft a plan for monitoring it, which is basically a bathymetric survey every 2 to 5 years, just to keep tabs on it. And we're going to update our O&M manual and make that an official policy. So we have some, to wrap this up, we've got some ongoing coordination with other city departments. Last year, you guys had 2 major flash flood events along the Hillside Levee back in August, and we had some channel issues over by Harrah's, where Rock Creek goes out to the Missouri River. We had some major erosion of the channel bank, and the Rock Creek is actually moving out of the district's property onto yours. So we tried to get the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to make those repairs at the government's cost. It took them about 6 months, but they finally denied it, and the levee district is going to have to pay for that on their own. So once we've got a design approved and ready for construction, we'll probably have to ask the city for an easement, if not some property, to go in and do the construction and maintain that channel. Every 2 years, we have to do megger testing of the pump motors, and that is one of the city's responsibilities as the operator of the pump stations. So the next scheduled testing is in November of this year, and we've talked to Pat, and he's included that in his budget. It is also time to clean out the culvert at Ozark, and under the easement agreement for which that culvert was originally installed, the city is responsible for the cleaning of that. And Pat has told us that that work is currently scheduled for August. And then finally, I think we have some continued evacuation planning and training that is just ongoing as we need it. All right, so that concludes our presentation. Do you guys have any more questions of us? Yes, sir.
We don't, no questions. I just appreciate the work you do. It's one of my favorite boards.
Appreciate the presentation.
I would say there's not much more important than water. Air and water, got to have them both, but water can be kind of dangerous. But we've got to have it to keep fires down, we've got to have it to drink, and we've got to have it to keep it out of the city. So I've always been a supporter of the levee. Without the levee, you don't have anything. You don't have a city anymore. So I had the pleasure a number of years ago when I just got on the council of taking a ride with the a couple of former fire chiefs ago around the levee. And it was very interesting. It would be nice if council people could get a chance to actually get on the levee, see what it's all about when they're driving down that road. You do a good job.
So I'd like to extend that invitation. If any of you would like a tour of the levee, we'd be happy to provide that. You know, the Missouri River is a formidable foe. You never, ever want to take your mind off of that. Like you said, Bill, without the levee system, we would not have a city. So it's of the utmost importance to us. We focus on it daily, pretty much. Yep. So in any event, we really appreciate the city's assistance, public safety, fire department, everybody. I mean, it's a small town. We all chip in, and really do appreciate it. So.
To add that an egregious situation would be the worst possible scenario. And you know, whether you believe in climate change or not, if that has anything to do with anything that could happen in the future, it could happen. And you can't plan for everything, but I think, and you guys probably do, plan for the worst possible scenario that you can think of if we can afford it. And I would support anything reasonably that the city could do to help keep that levee going.
We appreciate that. Thank you.
Zach?
I appreciate you also coming in, and that's a good idea, Bill, for us to get out there and actually see, the levee. But it is a vital part of protecting our city, so we definitely want to maintain it and make sure that it's viable. I know that when it was a year or two ago, the Army Corps of Engineers had an event about the bed degradation, and they actually took us out on a barge or something that we went out on, and that was impressive to see the river and kind of understanding what they're doing. So appreciate the invitation.
I think everybody's got to remember that old river wants to go bluff to bluff. Mankind changed it.
That's right. Anything else?
Thanks for the presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Need a second? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Thank you.